Chad, good to have you, man. Stoked to start this podcast with you. Let's get this thing started. I think we should just start off by doing some background for both of us, probably about how we got into tech. So, how'd you get into tech? Let's get some background on you and then some background on me. Let's dive in.
Yeah, let's do it. So tech, man, feels like everything's tech now, right? Which is kind of crazy to think about. But yeah, so for me, the quick background, my life was all about sports, really. I think, for me, I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I guess that's prerequisite to become a hockey player. So yeah, born in Winnipeg, lived in, Saskatoon soon after that. So Prairie Boy, standard story, outdoor rinks. Moved to Kitchener, Ontario when I was 8. So spent really those core years, which is where I reside today. So I'm in Kitchener, Waterloo. Spent, the 8 years old until 18. So 10 years in Kitchener, went to high school in Kitchener, ended up playing junior hockey with the Kitchener Rangers. And so my whole path was playing the NHL, right? My dad was really focused on supporting me there. So very grateful to him. And so I went really hard at the game of hockey from a pretty young age. And so it was obviously, there's a lot we could go into there, but to fast forward, I ended up going to Dalhousie University, played 4 years of hockey there. That's where I did my business school. Amazing city, Halifax. Had a good 4 years there, really good 4 years on the hockey side as well. Afterwards, jumped into pro, kept chasing it. Ended up in California in the Oilers organization for a bit, and then finally over to Germany. So Germany, I was pretty lucky actually. So looking back, I got to play in the NHL system, and I quickly got over to Europe. And usually that takes guys, hockey players, 4 or 5 years of proving yourself in the American system before you can kind of make the jump to Europe. And I got over there really right away. Anyway, all that to say, just to give people, like, that's where I was coming from. A very competitive household. I was always pushed to perform. I was always, that was my life. And how that ties into tech, I came back and I hung up my skates and I looked in the mirror and I was like, what the hell am I going to do? Right. Had a business degree, thankfully, went to school, but what's next? And a lot of people ask me that. So the natural segue was, his technology was sales. It ended up being sales initially, came from a sales household too. My father was a, corporate executive his whole career. And so naturally I fell into sales for the performance aspects of it, but also for, just the general vibe, right? The competitive nature. I kind of I needed that outlet. And so at the time decided to move to Toronto, get in the big city, right? Ended up meeting various different folks, got involved with accelerators there at Mars, 111, just got deep into the tech community and really that's where it all started. So, it very interesting kind of ride, but for me, that was a perfect segue. It was perfect to move from, the competitive aspects of being, and I was always supposed to be the guy that scored the goals or set up, the plays. And so moving from, having to perform and compete to carrying a quota and managing, a book of business was really how it all began. So that's kind of my background. But what about you? Take us through your story. How did you end up in tech?
Yeah, I jive with so much of that story, including the fact that you also have that East Coast background, but fairly similar mindset. No pro sports, but had been a lawyer downtown Toronto here. Had been gearing towards going to law school pretty much my whole life. Had that kind of same competitive drive. Had been practicing downtown for a couple of years and had a law professor end up reaching out to me and saying, "There's this new legal tech startup in the city that you're in. Should really check this out and get on the ground floor. You'll always have your license." And that's the attitude that I took. I was young. I have my law license. If this thing blows up, I can always go back. And I still remember actually quitting in front of the managing partner that day and it just being so shocked by that, that attitude of, I'm going to roll the dice and I'm going to get involved in this company. And so I did. And when I joined, I was employee number 7 or so. We didn't have any revenue at all. And so I actually jumped into sales out of complete necessity. It was just a problem at the time to be solved. As we both know, it's a big problem, right? Especially early, to figure out our channel partnership and then to actually get revenue. And then from there, really loved it and stuck with it, built up the team. There's a little bit of an origin story to how you and I met through that. And then really have kept on with it. And at this point, I've actually given up my law license as of this year. So that was a big step as well.
Yeah, a lot to talk about there for sure. So yeah, why don't we talk just maybe quickly about the Rev program and how you and I met? I think you just touched on it. So why not just unpack that a bit more for everyone? I think that's an important sort of background there for sure.
Yeah. So this is how Chad and I met. I mean, I was with this startup. We were at $0 when I got there. We were scaling, going through all the same problems that so many companies in Canada and in Toronto and Waterloo do, which is just getting your first customers, getting channel partnerships that work, getting your first big customers. So we signed up to be in the Rev program, which I believe was you had to have 2 million in revenue or something like that at the time. So I remember Ben and I driving out to Waterloo to make this pitch in front of that Rev group about why they should accept us and bring us in. But amazing program, right? So you were there, Rod Foster was there, Paul Thompson, a whole crew of executives who had already done what we were looking to do. And I remember having those weekly check-ins with Paul and Rod, with me for sales and a little bit of the marketing and the customer success team, but also those monthly boardroom sessions. And through those 6 months, as anybody that's grown a startup to Series A, the company completely transformed. And I remember presenting to you in particular a big enterprise deal that was kind of a make or break for the company at the time. Like we had to win this deal to raise our next round. And we'd pretty much gone through everything that you could go through in terms of it not happening, including the market leader in the space that we were in telling us it would never happen. Just straight out, like you will never do this. And I still remember those phone calls with you strategizing on not only how we were going to do it, but also doubling the deal value in terms of the services and truly selling in an enterprise sales motion, which is just a fantastic experience. But yeah, it actually, I don't think I've ever heard the story from you about how you first got in that's obviously how we met, but how you got involved in Communitech and the Rev program from your experience in Toronto.
Yeah, for sure. So let's definitely bring that together. I spent 7 years in downtown Toronto. As I mentioned, that's where I initially started, initial individual contributor sales roles, into partnerships, really getting a mix of different things over a few years. And then we started Post Beyond. So Post Beyond was sort of looking back, such an amazing experience. So it was a 5.5-year journey. I was involved in the founding team back in late 2012, early 2013, right? So it was really the business super quick snapshot was a social media software. We were focused on compliance and really employee sharing on social media. So at the time, you can imagine Twitter blowing up, LinkedIn blowing up, Facebook as well at the time, right? Was what do we do as a large organization to support people are going to do social media, whether we like it or not. So how do we actually harness it? And so it was really good timing. It was a really cool, product. So I got to know obviously the two other gents. There were some other founders, but there was mainly three of us that really, from sort of seed inception, funding, grew it. My job was go get sales, go get customers. So yeah, the first 20 customers were me by myself. How do I pitch this new idea, new concept? So it's just so much learning there. So over 5 years, we grew the business a lot. We raised Series A capital. My job is to build out sort of marketing function, and then sales became sales development, as many of us, know today for doing outbound. And, the sales organization account executives, we ended up having a 2-tiered approach of commercial sort of focused reps and then enterprise reps. So this was all like the most insane, sort of like MBA on steroids, right? Like it just fell into it. The revenue really ramped up. We had to, pull it all together. And so 5.5 years of leading that kind of rose up from being that first salesperson to building all those teams up to sort of operating as a quasi, what many call like a CRO now, across, all the functions, which is what we'll get to. So 2017 ended up deciding to leave the business. I'd had my first son. As Mark knows, I have 3 now, under the age of 5. So you can imagine what my household's like. But my first son, Kellen, was born January 2016. And so really with that change in a man's life, I, summer 17 came around and it just made sense for me to move on from that business. And so we moved at that point, decided to move back to KW. which was in our plans. We're both from here. Janessa, my wife, and I are both from Kitchener originally, as I mentioned. So we moved back, and it was kind of like, what's next? And yeah, just as it happens, I met with the great group at Communitech. Ian Klugman, Greg Barrett at the time. You mentioned Paul and Rod, Heather Galt, Christina Wood. I could go on and on. Just amazing people. At the time, there was really a reinvention around some of the programming going on, and Rev being a main program, which is 6 months, as you mentioned, with startups roughly, $1 million or $2 million in revenue, and really looking to kind of scale things out. I got involved with that. And so it was a bit of a rebuild, really. It was rebuilding, how should we engage with companies? How do we bring them into the program? How do we spend 6 months together? How do we drive value for them and ultimately make them successful, right? Like, we want to be those partners. That's what Communitech is. For those that don't know, it's really one of the main innovation hubs. It's supported by the federal government in Canada, here in Kitchener-Waterloo. So that's kind of how it came together. I moved back, got involved, and it just really was a no-brainer for me. So I got involved doing that, and here we are, probably 100 plus startups later, been through that program, and fortunate to work with all of them, including yourself. And that's kind of the background as to how I got involved with Communitech specifically, and the Rev program.
Yeah, the Rev program, it was amazing. And I'm so curious to hear, and this kind of gels into the podcast and also what we're doing more broadly, but your experience in doing the 6-month Rev program, building that program, seeing everybody go through it, what were a couple of common themes that that came across with so many companies? I can definitely say what I saw from our cohort, but you've seen so many.
Yeah, no, I think that's the most interesting thing. I'm super fortunate. I think, looking back now and reflecting as I have on that period of time, and the different companies, a lot of them, really majority, if not all, B2B focus, some marketplace, some with different modeling, but mostly B2B software businesses, tech startups, right, that are trying to get their legs. Yeah, the main thing, I guess this drives into a lot of what we're going to talk about in a bit, but one main thread is what I faced. I know what I faced in the Post Beyond business, just thinking I knew it all, and doing it all myself. And, oh, I'm so heroic, right? I'm going to go get all these sales, and I'm going to just recruit everyone myself, and it's just all going to be so great, and it's all about me. You realize that it's just impossible. It's like so much about the team you build. And so the main thread, I would say, which is where I focus a lot of my energy today, is on the idea of revenue operations, right? So as a sales leader and focused on customer activity, like, it falls by the wayside, especially initially, right? You don't think in systems initially. You're just trying to, like, keep the thing alive, right? So now this has become, much more of a topic. There's certainly, thinking about the entire customer life cycle, and all of the different software there is now. But back then it was like, you didn't think about it properly, right? You just kind of like tried to grow sales and tried to hire some people, and it was just all very disorganized, right? So I would say the main thread to answer your question was, if I looked at every single company, really every single one, and this is part of that kind of view that I had in those experiences, was you always hit a wall at a very specific point in time. Usually you've raised some capital, you maybe have a couple of salespeople or customer focused folks on your team, and now it's like, whoa, like, I need to actually do some planning. I need to actually build a process. I need to actually use a CRM. Like, you hit that wall. And I would say that consistency that I saw across the board was a main one I would highlight. And a lot of it, these are amazing folks, right? Like, yourself included, the team at Blue Jay. Like, you don't do startups if you don't have a certain level of, like, just integrity and ambition, right? Like, it's really hard, right? So that aside, I think it's so hard to focus on the operations. It's kind of like, it's the in the business, on the business kind of stuff, right? Like, you're just so caught up in trying to have customer calls and trying to do deals, right, and trying to make things work, that you don't actually set up the internal side of the house. And so I kind of think about that as revenue operations, or that kind of the revenue engine, which ultimately is the business. And that was kind of the main thread that I saw throughout. And the consistency over and over again was just like, we're going to hit a wall. We need to prepare for it. We need to start planning ahead of it. And that was the key part. And that allows you to scale and ultimately, find the success you're looking for. Right.
Yeah, 100%. And we've talked about this, and this is the exact idea behind the podcast as well, right? There are unique experiences, but there's also a path that a lot of other people have taken. And when you're in your own business, especially a startup, you really get siloed heavily into thinking that nobody outside can look in and help, and nobody's done this journey when so many have, particularly in Canada. And I've been on with so many founders, and the way that I've now described seed to series A and maybe a little bit beyond too is you're really just walking around in the desert trying not to step on a landmine. It's really all you're doing from seed to series A. Like you're really just trying to not make a company ending mistake early and just try, to get enough customers to justify another round. Hopefully a lot of them renew. You're kind of walking around with the blindfold on, just trying not to step on one. And you think that your experience is unique, but so many other people have done that exact path before, and so many people can help you. This is really what I saw through Rev. And the Canadian experience, I think, is a unique one as well, where other Canadian companies have gone through what you're going through and can help you not step on that landmine. And that's really kind of, to me, if I were to put this into a few words of what we're doing, it's really giving them that path.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to share, I think, collaboratively with folks. And it should be open sourced. I think that's our idea here, right? There's so many great stories. I think working, thinking about founding stories, you're just people really chasing their vision. We want to tell those stories, right? I think there's some tactical things we're going to get into. You and I weekly diving into specific topics, and sharing some worksheets and guides and various things we have for the listeners. But I think outside of that, there's meeting founders, and we're going to interview them, and we're going to hear their stories, and we're going to there's so many cool backgrounds and diverse ones that need to be shared. And so I really, yeah, it's a really interesting time to be, in Canada, one, two, in the corridor, Toronto Waterloo corridor, as many are calling it. And I think, with you being in Toronto, me being Waterloo, there's some great perspective there from both sides. And yeah, excited to just share that with everyone. I think there's a lot to be gained from all being on the same page together, and continuing to build our community based on that.
Yeah, I mean, what 100% that's what we're doing. Like, what would you say to somebody about what makes Canada different? I mean, we're seeing rapid growth. We have all these great hubs, right? We have Communitech, we have Mars, we have 111, we have a whole bunch of different places, and we have startups, especially in the AI realm, really rapidly growing. But what would you say to people about doing it in Canada versus elsewhere that you've seen?
Well, I guess there's some funny aspects you could bring up, right? Just in terms of the general thoughts a lot of people have about Canadians being so nice and whatnot. We won't go there. But yeah, this school, I mean, University of Waterloo, the AI programs, Perimeter Institute. I mean, we could go on and on. There's a lot happening here in that field, specifically around software, and I think, I mean, maybe to take a step back for a second, right? Like, my view of it is that, which is really exciting to me, is like every business is becoming a tech business or a software business, right? There's a lot of industries that you wouldn't, right away think about as like tech, but this is what's changing, right? Everyone is starting to leverage these awesome software tools we have. Everyone's starting to, rebuild and rethink their businesses. So it doesn't matter if you're in distribution or in trucking or in, any industry. Now you have the ability from the revenue side and commercial side of how you think about it to bring in all of this new thinking and technology, and that, by way of that, it makes you a technology business, is the way I think about it. So coming back to Canada, I think we're just in a really interesting time. Canada is such an interesting place to be. I think for me, being traveled and being spending a lot of time in the US, both with customers as well as on my own, and for various reasons, and in Europe and in other places, right? We just have there's so much to share about what goes on here. I think we're very well positioned to support the US as well. There's a lot of great stories around that, which we'll talk about, where there's the ability, the cross border side of things, the fact that we're up here, the cost, the recruiting, the hiring, the talent. All of those things are an advantage. I mean, we won't get into the politics of it, but those are main things, I think about. And so, it's just a great time to be in Canada. I think you look cross border, right? All the way Vancouver, all the way to the East Coast, and down here in Southern Ontario. Um, there's just so many cool things happening, and I think it's really an awesome time to expose that.
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, I could just throw in three broad buckets in terms of things that are different, right? I mean, the funding's different. It just is. I mean, seed rounds are harder to raise here. It's harder to raise later rounds towards IPO. And just figuring that out, you need to talk to other founders to actually get a handle around that. Sales is different because we all want to sell to the US market. It's the biggest consumer market in the world. How do you go about doing that as the Canadian company? It's so funny that you mentioned about being nice, because that is actually what I've heard from other founders in terms of, do I need to hire US salespeople because Canadian salespeople won't be aggressive enough to close business,
Yeah,
right?
that's a funny one. I mean, I push back on that pretty hard. It's like, I'm kind of joking about, don't get me wrong, are Canadians nice? Yes. But I think end of the day, from the value that we're seeing, so many of the company stories we can tell, right? You look at Vidyards, you look at many that have established remote thinking in their business, which is a whole other thread of conversation. But like, it's a new game. I think fundamentally that's what we're talking about here. There's a lot we want to talk about from the Canadian perspective, but there's also just it's a new day, a new chapter. In light of the unfortunate circumstance of COVID, but otherwise, like, we're in a very cross-border, very globalized world now. And so I think, when you're building your business, regardless of what that business may be, we want to share our perspective. Living in the technology side of it, I think there's a lot to be gained for folks that are certainly building a technology business, but also folks that are looking to leverage technology and bring in more modern aspects to their company.
Yeah, and it just goes back to the talent conversation that you brought up too, right? Amazing dev talent here, especially out of Waterloo. And there is this, I mean, my own personal story for jumping into this too. There is a pull to the United States for some of the talented Canadian folks. I myself was being pulled into New York. That's not going to happen. And I no longer want that to happen after this year. And that's like a whole nother thing. But there's a sense that I get, and you get this too, that Canada is in this accelerant period, and the decisions that we make now, the Shopify's, the big companies, attract more capital and they attract other companies. And that to me is really the source of this. Is I want Canadian companies that are just starting out to hear from some of the best ones now being recognized across the world, and to be emboldened by that as we continue to grow and attract more capital here. I think it's so important.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's an amazing time. We're seeing growth. I think I see it every day. Being that I'm in the KW area, and just the growth in this area is wild, right? I think from not only a population perspective, but you see the bigger companies, the Shopify's, the others setting up offices here. It's just a really cool time to be in Canada. I think we're going to see, with, you mentioned Shopify, there's some really great stories from a Canadian perspective that continue to happen, and that's going to continue to drive economic growth. We're always seen as kind of the apartment above the US, right? Like, we don't crack even, California as a population, and that's changing, right? I think that perception is changing, and I think that's really what we're wanting to talk about. There's so many interesting stories, and it's going to be fun to unpack those.
For sure. So let's dive in a little bit to the Rev program and what happened post that for you, and the conversations we had around that, right? And same thing happened to us at Blue Jay. Got great coaching from you, went into other programs, but it's so important for these communities to actually grow and learn from each other the whole time, and not just for 6 months. So why don't we talk about, like, what happened for you generally when startups would reach back out to you and say, look, Rev's over, but we still need some help.
Yeah. So for me, when things started 2017, sort of later 2017 initially, so into 2018, yeah, back to kind of the thread I was talking about, this revenue operations storyline, I guess, or what we were speaking about before. So I set up a business, called it Corridor Labs initially, and that's what it is today. So Corridor Labs is really what I call revenue operations on demand. With the problem I saw, and the problem I see all the time, back to what we talked about, not only with the Rev accelerator companies, but in general, is there's no focus of investment on folks on the commercial side for a period of time unless they're quota bearing, which is
Mhm.
a main thing I would say. So I think this is a huge mistake, and it's so easy to fall into it. As a founder, you're like, well, I can spend this money on a sales rep, or I can spend this money on this person that's, they're going to work on systems. And you're like, okay, it's obvious I'll go with option A, right? So that continues to happen, and then as we talked about before, things just completely fall down. So what I've been doing in building that is really just seeing this over and over again. And so we've really built a team, a product, bunch of products really, to support that. And really, its strategy is kind of one product, which is a lot of the planning that needs to happen. The go to market, it's really kind of sales finance, many call it that, but it's really, okay, let's look out into the future a bit. 12, 18, 24 months. That's actually, what is our plan, right? Usually that's driven, could be by funding, by whatever those circumstances may be, but we need to have a plan, right? We need to have a plan, and we need to not only just know what dollars look like, we need to know what a funnel looks like, and we need to actually tie down where our business is going to come from in order to see that growth, right? So there's this element of like go to market strategy, which we could talk about for a while, but that's kind of like a very core pillar, and it tends to be not where it needs to be, right? For a lot of the companies. Secondly is process. So naturally, if you're going to scale your team, you need to build process. So sort of process engineering or mapping is the way I think about it, but it's building out customer journeys. Nowadays it's even more vital because we have this interlock between marketing and selling and customer side of the equation, right? Like, and especially when we're asking people to renew their contracts with us, which many are, as we know, from a subscription perspective, it's even more vital. So once you have a strategy that's articulated and clear, now you can actually build process. And so that's where you're thinking about what everyone's going to do, right? That's what marketing is going to do to generate leads. That's what sales is going to do to actually charge people through a sales process and sell a deal, to then now we're going to onboard and make people successful and keep them around as customers, right? All that needs to be properly laid out. Again, usually something complete oversight. We might have a CRM with a few stages in it, and we put our contact names in there, but we don't actually have anything formal. So do that. Then finally, we implement systems. So that's where the systems thinking again, CRM is one piece, but as we know today, there's a lot more software to decide on and procure and make use of, that in many cases isn't super expensive. It's just more about knowing how it fits together. And so marketing, again, those pieces all fitting together. And then lastly is data and insights. The whole business today, data is the oil, every other cliche you want to talk about. But the reality is the systems you set up are going to feed your ability to metric and measure not only the business at an aggregate level, but your individual team members that are, again, commercially focused or oriented. So those are kind of the four main pillars or products. And so I kept seeing this and realized I just needed to serve this purpose, right? So we've set up a business to support that. We do basically on demand, where we plug into businesses, we act as their RevOps team for them. Usually it's between, they've a seed round up into even AB, or they're not doing rounds and they're not a VC thing, and they just actually need to rejuvenate or rebuild some of this stuff. And so we support those things. So yeah, that's the Corridor Labs business today. I mean, a lot of that came out of me seeing this and working with so many great companies in the Rev program and the accelerator. But in general, it's something that people don't think about early enough, and I'm passionate about that, and I felt it myself, right? Coming back to that, I lived the pain, enormous pain of doing it too late, not properly thinking about it, and not getting the support I needed. So the fact that I lived it, just realized that, this is a real new area. I think, for a lot of businesses, it's new. We may have had sales ops or someone as a Salesforce admin in the past, but now we're talking about a much more strategic seat at the table that is the foundation of your company. And if you can get that right, you can then hire against that. You can then continue to build the way you want to build, and you're going to be able to look at efficiency and effectiveness. Those are the two things I think about. That's really what RevOps is to me. It's the effectiveness of revenue and the efficiency of revenue. And so you can think about that through funnels and we can get all crazy into the data, but the bottom line is that how do you create more efficiency in your business, which then obviously creates effectiveness. Like those two things, and enabling your team to be successful and performance to be at a certain level is what we're after. And so that's what I've been doing, and that's what I've been doing today, as my core business. And there's definitely more that we'll get into that definitely I'm seeing and want to continue to build upon that. But that's really what we're doing, and we're supporting early stage companies, but also some more mature companies in the support of their revenue operations journey.
Yeah, totally. And it's not, if you don't have it at 20, right? If you don't have that foundation at 20, it's not going to get any easier at 50 or 100 or 200, right? Like that's when things really start to blow up. And this is the wall that you're talking about that you're seeing everybody hit. And I've experienced it too. And I've heard you describe the RevOps side because it seems like a fairly new concept, right? It's a new opportunity for customer lifecycle management and really understanding what that is. But selling SaaS software for lifetime value isn't new, right? That's the funny thing. So it's like, where did that misunderstanding come from for you in terms of the companies that you've seen? Why is this new now, or why is this just happening?
Yeah. The analogy I always use is teeter-totter, right? Tends to be pretty, clear for people when you go through it this way. So that you have your teeter-totter going both ways. Naturally, to get a business going, it doesn't matter if it's SaaS, software as a service or not, you add new clients or customers, logos, etc., to your business, right? So it's a net new adding customers. Then you get to a point where, whoa, the teeter-totter shifts, right? We got enough on the left side. Now they're starting to dip to the right. And that's where your many call customer success, account management, customer support, et cetera. That's a key moment right there, right? So, whoa, it's like now renewals are happening, 1 year later, and we're not ready for this, right? We've built a sales net new focused acquisition engine. And that's super hard to do. It's hard, real hard, right? You're going from zero, you're adding new, so you figure out a process and you make it work. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh geez, now we need to figure out this entire other side of the equation. And we weren't really thinking about it, but now renewals are coming up. People aren't sticking with us. They're like, you know what? It's good, but not good enough. And then you just you kind of freak out, right? As a business. So that's really what you're getting at. It's like, the life cycle is never ending now. I think about it as, in terms of order management or just the cycles of the way subscription works, right? We're seeing even innovation here where people can pause for a month, right? There's month on month and sort of annual aspects that obviously we can dig into, but that's the change, right? A lot of people, just don't think about that. It's usually an afterthought. And I think you look at perpetual software in the earlier days of how this all worked. When you bought software, you'd buy it up front. You know what I mean? You bought a maintenance contract, which was maybe 10, 20% of the purchase price. And it was just not aligned. Now you're talking about something that's completely consistent across the board and it never ends. So what does that mean? What does that do to your business? It makes you completely change how you think about the first order that you make, whether it's a pilot or how you start the relationship with a customer, and then ultimately how you're going to build team and build process around how you continue to support and deliver value to the customer. So that's the life cycle change, I think, and that teeter-totter is the way to think about it. Usually it gets way over to one side and it's not leveled up, and your job as a leader is to kind of level that thing off as soon as you can, right? Get ahead of it at least, so that as you get renewal periods coming up, you've built a sustainable sort of process and a customer journey that talks about not only the acquisition side of the equation, but ultimately the retention and growth side of the equation too. And so that's how I think about it.
Right. And I just want to focus on the importance of this, because the reason that you and I are so focused on this topic is because getting it wrong is company ending, right? It's like if you just over focus on the top line revenue from the beginning and you haven't figured out the other side and that just falls through on you. The thing that brought me to this was I'd seen so many great companies here in Toronto die because of this. It's actually a company killer, and it's probably the most common reason that you see a company fail around the Series A round. They just over focused on top line revenue, and they didn't figure this side of the equation out. They rushed to hire a bunch of CS people, and then I'm sure, as you've seen, tried to slot in a bunch of technology to try to fix things that they should have been thinking about way earlier, right? So the real issue is that the standard VC get to 2 million ARR SaaS playbook is broken. 2 million ARR isn't product market fit, right? Retention is early, especially early. And so for me, that's really the calling of this. You and I have both seen it. Is I've seen companies that have died that shouldn't die. And I'm seeing good companies that could be great companies if they just actually put in the process right, and actually started measuring their churn early and then built the tech on top of that. But it's just worth emphasizing because it's so critical to a company's success or failure.
Yeah. Yeah, no question. We're living in a buyer's world, right? Customer's world. That's been talked about for a while, but you nailed it. The If you don't do it early enough, it's tricky too, right? I mean, that's what we're going to talk about. I think it's exposing that. The reality is that you need to package, you're building product. There's product management, the way you do product marketing, right? Which to me is that commercial side of product management, messaging, packaging your product, right? So that you can influence growth in an account, right? So it's not just a one-time, linear line. Ideally, you can, well, how do you stack that up? Are you doing like there's these decisions, right? And it's so dependent on who your customer is and like, what value you're driving. And the more that you can get into kind of those aspects earlier, again, which is sort of a gap I see. It's like we're not thinking enough about kind of the value framework or value propositioning around growing, like not first order. Jason Lemkin is the king of this, but the second order revenue, right? Which is to your point, it's not about first order. First order could be a lighter transaction. The second order, be it renewal or ultimately ideally expansion, is the driver of, as you stated, product market fit. And Mark Roberge is talking about a lot of this now, which is amazing and it's so bang on, right? But it is like, how do you optimize for like the sustaining value? It's really about the second order and beyond. So do you tune? Do you do proof of concepts? Do you do pilots to prove that out, right? To show you can get second order commitments, right? How do you think about your duration or term of contract, right? These decisions and how that ultimately you tune the value of your product and how it's packaged to grow is the key piece. And to your point, that's where companies they've not thought about that. They're just hoping to sell get any revenue, period. And that's just, you just can't approach it that way. You have to think about that early around what metrics am I moving, right? Who's the buyer of this thing? How am I really driving that value and making sure I'm articulating that well? Because then you're able to properly tune sort of not only, we're very focused on the SaaS model, but any business, whether it's repurchase, it's about growing an account, right? In general. And so if you're thinking about it, there's a baseline, there's growing it, there's keeping it, all that fun stuff. End of the day, it's the same sort of activity and it's the same things you need to do internally. And I think that particular part is, to your point, is extremely important to talk more about and support companies with, because it's going to completely change their world if they can do it well.
What I've seen is I think that's one of them, at least early, and we can talk about later stage. And it's almost its whole own episode or own thinking is just around this concept. But overfitting for attention very early, because everybody is thinking that they're going to be Slack, but they forget that even Slack has the data to know that they need to get you to send 1,000 messages in 60 days to have you be a lifetime customer. Like they experimented with that early, but everybody's just kind of hoping that part of the equation is going to fix itself. And they just need to hire the VP sales and 10 sales reps and get to the 5 million and pop champagne. And I'm almost just wondering, I mean, I'm curious because this thought just popped in my head too, but you and I being from the sales world and being early sales leaders, it's like, I remember it's almost, I think we almost celebrate the new logos too much and we barely celebrated renewals at all when it really should be the opposite. It's almost it's almost a shift of the entire mindset, right? Because when you go into those boardroom meetings, the first slide is always what's top line revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, for sure that shift is, it's funny just as you're saying that, I was just picturing all of that in my head, right? A million times over. It's like sales side, close a new deal, yes, it's extremely hard to acquire new customers, right? From scratch, like the marketing, the sales cycle, like all of that to like the heroic effort, right? You win the deal and it's like, but to your point, like people seeing value and, signing up for an annual for 12-month contract, staying with you all the way through that, providing you great feedback, that side of the story it needs to be, again, back to the teeter, you really need to know when to do it properly, but you need to think about it early and you need to focus on it. You do need to celebrate it like heck, because it's everything we know. And it doesn't matter what your business is, but being able to properly establish value and build proper, relationships with, whether it's through your product digitally or it's, through your team that you've built to do so. That's the game. It's shifting completely. You're seeing funding, all of the different economic dynamic, I guess, change due to that too. People are just getting, those are the questions they're getting asked a lot quicker, when it used to be like, well, how fast are you growing top line? Like, how fast are you acquiring new logos? And it's now changed. I think that's a great thing I'm seeing. It's getting more like, what is the diversity of this revenue? Are we expanding? Are we seeing that net negative churn? Are we seeing these types of things? And those are good signals. And I think that's a good point for sure.
What do you think has to lead that movement and mindset? Does it need to be VC led? Is it founder to founder in this community? Because part of it, I want to get that message out there, but you want it to be self-sustaining in a way in this community, right?
Yeah.
VC might celebrate, and VCs aren't bad, right? They're just trying to get their own returns for their own funds. And that usually means 10X in growth as soon as possible. But it's just that mindset has to come from, in some ways, founder to founder, I feel.
Yeah. I think the way I think about it is, customer success as a term, I think is worth talking about for a sec, right? Like, the way I think about it is it's not necessarily a function of your business. Like, many call it a function. I actually don't like that. I don't think it's the function. I think it's the overall.
We could dive into this.
I think it's the overall picture of the company. And then there's like Gainsight, and many of the others have talked about this. This isn't a new thing, but I think some people call it customer success managers versus account managers. Like, the context matters, right? The nomenclature. Customer success as a focus of the business, so that you are to everything we just talked about, the metrics around retention, around expansion, around value creation, is the focus of the business, right? So you're not over optimizing for first order acquisition. You are focused on the broader, longer tail, more longer term thinking, which, again, to your point, I think there does need to be a mind shift change, where from maybe it is venture on the venture capital side, or it's the board side of it, where it's like, we need to make sure these metrics that we're looking at the right things. We need to make sure that we are not overemphasizing one thing or another, because there's obviously a lot of pressure in these businesses. Everyone wants to grow, everyone wants to be successful. And I think, we really need to make sure that we're tuning the right things. And I think that's where some of the issue comes from. So it's a mix of things, but I think thinking about customer success as a broader company initiative, more so than just a function after we sell something, right? Moving away from the customer support, sort of like reactive thinking, to proactive thinking. And that's what like all the best businesses are doing. They're focusing not only their product management and their product work, but their customer support, right? If we just call it customer support, they're getting to a proactive place, right? They're not waiting for people to come with issues, right? It's not a ticket world anymore. It's actually a very smart, programmatic, messaging and notification driven approach, where people are getting value consistently from the product and from the team that's supporting them, right? So like, that's the way I think companies, if they can do that and they can start to think about it that way, with that mindset, you're going to see just a dramatic growth, because it's an expectation customers have now, but if you can set it up properly and you can start to think about it properly, then you're really going to pay some serious dividends there, for sure.
Yeah, I think I really dislike the term customer success in some ways too, because you just get this mindset of, I just need to hire some people to onboard and renew, onboard and renew, onboard and renew. And that's like it's a deep topic that we could go into. But if you think about who really carries the number in an annual recurring revenue, lifetime value style business, right? If you're growing right and it's the compounding returns, then customer success owns the number. So it's like shifting that consciousness. And when you think about where the easiest new orders can come from, it's from your existing customer base, where the easiest additions to your product are going to be, to your messaging are going to be. It needs to be taken so much more seriously. I'm just curious, do you have a story or a situation where you've kind of gone in and had to have that shift mindset with a board or with a founder group, and how that went?
Yeah, all the time. I think, this is all new thinking. I mean, it's not that new. I mean, SaaS and, what Salesforce has paved the way to from a model standpoint, and just a lot of the general framing that we're talking about. But it's still, majority of companies, I would say, like the vast majority, it's still this separate sales and like customer side thinking. It's still separate. Never mind the marketing. Marketing and sales gets talked about a lot in terms of like the lead and deal
Yeah.
deal fighting, which is getting better. But I think that's formally what we're talking about. We're talking about revenue operations as like a base layer, as like a supporting core. But there is like, that's where the rise of like, CRO or whatever name, there's a broader view of the customer experience, like someone that owns that in total. That's why, right? Because it is one number. You're looking at different, drivers. Okay. One team is focused on net new. That is their job. Their whole process is tuned to that. They work very closely with marketing around bringing in, the newcomers. And then there has to be operationally a setup for the other side of it. But those two things need to tie up, right, to the same picture naturally. And that's a shift for a lot of people, right? Like it's to your point, culturally as well. We're used to sales, sales. It's like this focused on, the sales organization and what traditionally was. Now you do have to like almost think about how your teams actually interconnect, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a high LTV enterprise sale over here, your $1 million deal, and you got your consumerized sort of marketplace play over here, right? These are very different businesses, very different revenue engines, very different setup, right? But the reality is that's not typically, that's actually a huge issue a lot of the time, which is what we're getting at, where you think you're already an enterprise sale, but you're actually a commercial mid-market sale or an SMB sale, and you're trying to operate your model as an enterprise sale when you're not really there yet. That's one thing. But I think the minute you can like really at the core understand who you are today, right, from that model perspective, and I think it's important to start from LTV, to your point. Like, what is the lifetime value? Is this, because that's going to give us the whole, how many customers do we need to get to this revenue, right? It gives you your customer count, it gives you your entire model. And so that's really where I think people tend to struggle at first, is just like they're kind of operating in a way that they're not there yet, right? And so that affects, like, usually the main discussion, which drives into what you're saying, whether that's with the board or whether that's with the founders, where it's like, let's really understand what we are now, because that's going to change everything that we design for, right? It's going to change how sales operates. It's going to change. Do we bring in a sales engineer? Is there a joint sales process? Is there all these things, right? How customer success is going to onboard? Are they going to do heavier touch onboarding? Well, if the customer, is paying X dollars, then we can probably make that model work, right? So you have to start there, and then that's going to help establish what your success side is going to look like, right? Are you going to have a support team and a success team and our accounts team and an onboarding team? Can you afford to do that in your model? Maybe not. Okay, it's going to be one team that's going to do it all to begin with, right? Your sales team is going to stop purely at acquisition. They're going to be quoted against that. They're going to bring in only new logos. They're not going to do any expansion. Like, all these decisions, right? You have to start from who are we? What is the LTV expectation of our customer? If you're here or here, and there's charts and things we can go through, but really, I think you decide that first. That tends to be something that's a bit vague and foggy for people. You decide that's going to decide everything else, right? Because now you're going to be able to build your structure and your teams around that concept that you decided on, which is going to make everything easier. And usually that's the main debate, because people just, I don't think I need that. And this, well, it's like, look, you're selling deals that are this much, like, this is what's going on. So we need to invest there for those reasons. And so I think that helps clear it up. But I think I would push people to think from the vision of LTV. Like, how long is the customer going to stay with us? How much is that going to be worth to us? We can then properly establish how the team should structurally be set up, and ultimately it could be metriced based on that.
Yeah, I love that so much. I mean, that's exactly where they need to start from. It's not about, we need to just bring on as many new logos and hire some salespeople to chase every dollar of possible revenue top line in the beginning. It's every customer that we bring in who's actually going to stay with us for 15 years from our perspective, just to run as a business, but from their perspective to get value for long term. Those are the segments that we can actually scale out and hire the salespeople around, not the other way around. The salespeople aren't going to sell in a magical way. You can sell ice to an Eskimo once, but you're probably not going to get them to renew for 15 years, right?
Yeah,
It's
and I
like,
think on that point, a lot of the time, that's a segmentation thing too that falls out of this. So it's the minute you can establish kind of the first point, then the second point of like who the customer, like everyone talks about ICP or ideal customer profiling, like you need to narrow your scope, especially as a startup business or like a business that's just getting rolling. Laser sharp focus on knowing like, you know, who and where, right? I think about it as all the graphics, right? Firmographic, how big is the company? Geographic, where are they? Like these graphics, technographically, what tech do they use, right? Those are the three main ones. And then you can say, well, great, well, we are focused on a mid-market organization that has these attributes, right? And now we're going to have a good story because, oh, look at our customer base has all of those same people, right? It makes your life so much easier. And most people, it's the spray and pray. It's just this wide, right? It's like I'm just gonna go to anyone that knocks on my door, and I'm gonna hopefully bring something in. And like everyone gets that feeling. Like when you're first starting out, you're like, is this even something people care about or want? But the more that you can be confident in just like really thinking through that to begin with, but you're going to be able to have the rinse repeat, which again is what everybody wants, both from a process perspective and from a just like case study perspective. Like all of it becomes more clear and clean if you can again think about that earlier. So you know, this is really what we're saying. I think there's a foundation here that we've both lived many times over. And I think it's important to share with people. And I think there can be a lot of, hopefully a lot of value for folks to sort of get that stuff set up earlier. And then they're kind of off to the races. And that's definitely what we want.
yeah. And to be clear, I mean, we'll go into the podcast model a little bit now because we're going to end off this particular one, but you and I are going to be discussing this exact topic many times and in many different ways because it's the key foundational point, especially early, right? It's getting this right and not getting it right when you have 50 employees and not getting it right when you have now 10 million and you just lost five. It's so if you just got it right with just a couple 100K in revenue, you'd be so much better off. And we've seen that play out in so many different ways. So let's jump into just the model of this and what we're doing. So our plan is you and I are going to meet weekly and do new episodes together. Maybe we can even do this in a live format at some point. But we're both going to be interviewing. I'm in Toronto and you're in Waterloo, and that's the other thing that I love about this. Right, we're right down the middle in the corridor. I'm going to be interviewing founders. You'll be interviewing founders, RevOps specialists, and we'll be producing all that sort of content too. So yeah, super excited to get this rolling with you, man.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun. Really excited to interview. There's so many good stories, as I mentioned. So, you know, you and I being able to talk shop, I think we'll capture some questions from folks. I mean, if there's anything, you know, that anyone specifically wants to dive into, that's let's hear it. Right? We're definitely open to anything you guys are thinking about and where we can help. And then, you know, you'll see interviews mixed in with a lot of the great founders. Um, and executives, right? Not just people that have founded necessarily, but folks that are doing really cool things and building a lot of this stuff right now. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. Look forward to getting more episodes rolling soon.
Yeah, for sure. And if you do have, I mean, reach out to both Chad and I on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a new connection. If you have questions or something you want us to cover, happy to take it there. I'm in the midst of launching the site specific for the podcast, so we'll get that rolling as soon as possible. But yeah, I'm stoked. This is going to be awesome. Got a ton of stuff lined up.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right.
What do you think?